Hello and welcome back to a Coven Reads podcast. I'm your host Randy and I'm joined by Ryder, Becky, and B.
Hello.
Hi! And just right off the bat, I have exciting news. Our Coven sister Abby had her baby very early this morning, and the absolute Titan did it completely unmedicated, and my mind's blown.
It's incredible. This baby came in under a solar eclipse and just like so fast.
Like came in hot too. My goodness, so fast.
Yeah, so we're all very excited. That's like the number one thing on our minds today, I think. But the show must go on. So, just as a recap, we're a small Coven in PA, and we've decided to read through Keeping Her Keys by Cindy Brannon. Tonight, we're going to be diving into lesson 3 for the second cycle. As a reminder, we're working on a monthly lunar cycle, starting and ending with the new moon, and we will have a new episode out at the end of every month. At the end of last episode, we posted on Instagram asking if anyone wanted to share how Hecate appears to them, and I had 2 responses that I wanted to read. One is from the Castaway Pod, and I immediately followed them because they basically have paranormal podcasts, and I'm all about that. So, she said that she's a tall woman with long black hair and dark features, in black or deep purple robes with her dogs beside her. Big energy, sometimes grown, but usually younger depending on her message. And then we also had Space Viking 0220, who said she comes to them as a woman in dark clothing accompanied by a large dog. So I know, like, I think someone else, one of you, had mentioned that she kind of appears similarly.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I always see her with a dog that looks exactly like my dog.
Yeah, yeah. So the long black hair, because I was like, oh yeah, see her as like darker skinned, but always with a dog as well.
It's so
Hmm.
interesting. I love when, things like that occur and people can sort of like verify their own experiences against each other. It just gives a
Hmm.
little bit of fun credibility to all of this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely like a lot more validating than like the beginning days of my practice. I was like, I'm either insane or this is real. So I'm gonna go with this is real.
Oh my gosh, B.
Well, I did want to mention, like, randomly, 2 days before the first episode went live, Cindy Brannon announced that she was doing her own read along of the book on her YouTube channel. And we just want to put it out there that we think that's incredible timing and that it worked out that way. And they want to make it clear that we're not trying to compete or take away from the author's intention to share. We just kind of view it as a sign of some swell of energy that the group at large needs right now. And we feel honored to be in touch with that.
Yeah, exactly. So I was watching her videos that she had put up on her YouTube channel for this read along, and one of them was a Q&A of the introduction with the librarian of the Covina Institute, of which Cindy is the executive director and lead instructor. And in it, Cindy was describing how this book came about, and she was reading another witchcraft book, and she didn't resonate with a lot of the material, so she started marking things up and making notes to apply them more directly to her practice. And I just want to say that hearing that from her made me feel so much better about the way that I've been approaching her book as the resident chaos practitioner, um to like take what she has written and tweak what I need to fit it into my own practice in return. And she even says herself in that video that I'm a big fan of the you do you practice, so I just think that's super important to call out for others reading this book who may not be vibing word for word with what's going on. And it's also really indicative of how supportive Brennan is of just self-empowerment and figuring out what works best for you.
Yeah, and I do love that she mentions that Hecate really inspired her to create the blog that then led to the writing of this book. Because similarly, Hecate inspired and pushed me to develop this podcast, um, and begin this podcast with a book that is centered on her. So,
Full
um,
circle.
yes. Anyway, this cycle's lesson is titled Working with Hecate. And Brandon takes us into a lot of detail on how to build our relationship with her. And Cindy starts with a little bit of her backstory. So I thought we could dive deeper into our experiences. Ryder, did you want to start?
Yeah, so I started on my journey with Hecate last spring. It was around Mother's Day, And I know that specifically because we plant in this zone in Pennsylvania, we plant on Mother's Day. Um, so my husband was clearing out some landscaping outside of our house to expand our garden, and he found a bunch of snakeskin sheds in these shrubs. And so of course he was like, my wife loves weird shit. And so he saved them for me. And when I got home, I got into every correspondence book I could. I got on Google and I was like, what do snakeskins mean? What does this represent? What's this symbol? And that's when I came across a lot of information on Hecate, and it referred to her a lot as the goddess of the crossroads. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, because I felt like at that point I was at a crossroads, sort of between letting go of an old version of myself and fully committing to this path of being a witch. And I was struggling a lot with my self-worth and with my confidence. And it said she had association with garlic. And that was weird because we had just wintered over our first ever garden, our pandemic garden. For those that don't know, I'm a green witch and I love gardening, and I have a huge garden now. But at this time, all we had was this one raised bed of just garlic, that we had planted in 2019 or the year before, and wintered over. So I was like, okay, sign number 2. That's kind of weird. And then the third thing I read about her was her being the keeper of keys and having this symbol of the key being associated with her. And so just that year, I had started collecting skeleton keys and like cast iron locks for absolutely no reason other than that. Like, I kept finding them in thrift stores and I was like, these are cool. I love antiques. And so I was like, okay, that's it. There's too many coincidences for me. So, and I had already been down the deity road with Odin previously, so I kind of was familiar with deity work at this point. So yeah, I saw the signs. The math was mathing. I was like, maybe I'll just put a few things on altar and maybe say a prayer and see if anybody comes through. And she did. She came through immediately. I don't think it was that same day. I think it was maybe a couple days later. But I was meditating and I don't know if I fell asleep or projected, but either way, I had this really profound vision or dream of her, that I was walking through this like really beautiful dead of winter like snowy forest with my dog Chevy, who's my familiar and who happens to be a black shepherd collie mix. And I call her Queen Chevy. I call her my queen because she's very queen like. And so we came across this mirror, and as we got closer to this mirror in the forest, I realized it wasn't us in the mirror. It was this long, dark-haired woman. She had this like sort of dark armor on, and she had a dog that was identical to mine. And this is how I've always seen her: is in this like dark armor, the long dark hair, the dark features, like someone had said previously. And that's when I'm looking in this mirror, and she told me that I was being too quiet and that I was wasting my potential, and that I needed to basically fully commit to being a witch out loud and just go find my people and start living my truth and be her torchbearer. And she was very firm about it. And I wasn't scared or anything. It just felt very comfortable and familiar. Like it felt like I was talking to a friend who was maybe disappointed in me and was like, you need to do better. Um, and since then, she's helped me with so much shadow work. Oh my goodness. I've healed my mother-daughter wound with her. Um, I'm definitely on a path to being the best version of myself through her. I found my confidence, I found my people, I found my coven, and I've learned to handle my anxieties with her. I definitely still have anxiety about a ton of stuff, but I've definitely learned triggers and coping mechanisms through doing shadow work with her. I've come into my own as a mother with her. I've developed my practice. I've expanded my mind with her. It's been a very long, very tough year and a half, and I'm very grateful for it. And I really look forward to continuing to work with her in her different forms.
That's awesome. It sounds like you were, as soon as you found out it was her, you were like, all right, I'm ready to work with her.
I was like, this is it for sure.
Yeah. But it's funny because then Brandon then goes on to talk about how some people are just not ready to work with her. And I think, B, you had that, didn't you?
Yeah, definitely. So Hecate really started becoming parent, or I really started recognizing her in my life shortly after I started working with Anubis and Bast, and they were becoming more central in my life. And I began working with their mythologies, making my first offerings, just like for like introductory deity work type stuff. I started working with them in January of 2021 after I began my big Year of the Witch project, though I do suspect that they have both had influence on my life for a lot longer period of time that I'm still discovering.
Funny how that works, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I started really like recognizing and kind of feeling more called to in the springtime, which Ryder, I wasn't really I didn't know that you were called to her around kind of May or Mother's Day, you were saying. So
That's
awesome.
so funny because I don't think we knew each other in May of last year.
We did not. I don't think so, which is hilarious. I don't think we met until like September.
Yeah, that's so funny. Oh my goodness.
It's so weird. So I just was like seeing references to her everywhere. Like I just kept seeing the name everywhere. I kept seeing the symbols of keys. And it really started kicking organizing those group meetings. And it really felt like she was saying, like, okay, so after 10 freaking years of not working besides Oregon, you're gonna work with two deities and they're not me, like, and you're gonna start doing the stuff that I wanted you to do anyways. Like, yeah, right, like you're not. That was very energy I got from her. So it was very funny. But in August, like a few days after the second like super successful Lunasa gathering, where like our group really like almost like doubled in size. Like the first gathering we had, there were 6. There was like closer to 20. So basically that's when I kind of had my first dream with her, and I feel like I really connected with her then, but I was so hesitant to do so because I just felt like so not ready. I was like, oh my gosh, like I just got out of my comfort zone and now I need to get out of my comfort zone again and learn the rules of a new pantheon again. Great. So yeah, that was definitely my experience.
Yeah, I remember actually talking to you because we were friends at that point. And I remember you saying, her energy is so intimidating, I can't.
Right.
And then like a couple weeks later, you were like, never mind, I'm working with her.
I was like, I don't wanna. And then I just it got to a point that I was just like, yep, I guess this is just my life now.
That's so funny. Yeah, well, okay, so, we have talked about how was on the first episode, how I'm like curious and really approaching this book with like research aspects and curious if my relationship with Hecate is going to rekindle or grow. So when I was going through this chapter and it's talking about like how she communicates with people, I really just kind of sat down and like meditated on reconnecting. And I had another very frank conversation with her. She showed up and she was basically just like laughing at me while I was attempting to reignite a relationship because she totally saw through me and she was like, this is just for appearances because you're on this podcast and like for this book. Like, that's the only reason you're reaching out to me. But like, so after we like got through that, she like totally gave me the confidence to just go with grace. Like I was justifying a whole bunch of stuff to her and she's like, there's too much logic here, what do you feel? And like I hear pretty explicit like words and conversations in my meditations like that, so this was like a full-on conversation. So she was like, there's too much logic here, what do you feel? And I was like, that I don't really need to work with you right now. And she's like, exactly, I led you where you need to go and I introduced you to who you need to work with, so just like keep doing what you're doing. So I'm just, having that settled feels really great and just has like really given me the permission, as well as Cindy's message. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the like you do you messaging, they are very parallel. I got that from both of them, of just like enjoy the book, take what's going to be great for you and leave what's not, and you'll figure it out.
Yeah, I
I
think
love that.
from feedback that we've gotten, your point or point of view is valuable. for people who don't want to work with Hecate.
Yeah, and I love that I'm involved in this, but there has been a lot of like imposter syndrome sort of thing. Not that any of you have ever made me feel that way. You're always like, "Oh, we love this is going to be great. You've said this from day one," but I just needed to hear it from her, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So, my first connection to Hecate was really a lost in translation type situation. I was going through like a really difficult time for me. I had to put down my dog Kenobi. He was only 5. He had like a rare immuno disorder, and I just had this overwhelming feeling of helplessness and that I had somehow failed him, even though we did a lot of expensive treatments, and in the end, it was for his best. But I had a dream where a woman stood on a riverbank opposite me, and I could tell she had like long dark hair, but her features were very like obscured. And we just were like staring at each other until she turned to look behind her, and a pack of black dogs came bounding out of the forest behind her, and one of them was my Kenobi. And I could
Aw.
tell he was just content. And that was all she showed me at the time. And when I woke up, I did some quick Googling. I thought it was the goddess Hel. And I was absolutely convinced. I mean, I made her a candle. I was doing all the research. Yeah, so I really focused on that hellhound aspect, and over time I came to realize that it was not Hel, it was Hecate. I think she was a bit offended. um, but you know, she forgave me, and just with this chapter, I felt called to like make her a new candle because I was using the same candle that I had thought was when I thought it was Hel, which looking back, that's very bad. But so I made her I got a beeswax candle, I anointed it with olive oil, rolled it in rose, wormwood, lavender, and then I actually took some of Kenobi's ashes and added it to the candle.
Aw.
So
I love how you, Randy, are sharing that when you had to put Kenobi down, Hecate showed up with him. And Ryder, that even though Chevy is still here, that you see her with that. And it's just, I don't know, it's just really cool, the parallels that you guys have.
yeah. So yeah, in addition to like, so obviously black dogs are one of her symbols. Um, so other common signs and symbols, keys, torches, um, and she then talks about how symbols can kind of be unique to the practitioner. I know, for example, like spiders is one of the things that I associate with Hecate simply because they are a symbol of the crossroads to me. I think of the hedge, which is a type of crossroads. Um, does anyone else have any specific symbols for Hecate?
Yeah. So I actually have like a couple specific ones. Another, like, I think you mentioned like the crossroads. Something similar that with Hecate is like the labyrinth, or like the maze, which we often see in Hecate's wheel, which is kind of like that really beautiful symbol with all the squiggles in it. If you guys are, I also associate the snake and the key with her, and right now I kind of feel like these are the that I associate with her because these are the things that she is calling me to work on. So I really feel like she's kind of leading me on this journey through lots of doors, both physically, metaphysically. And I really identify with her key keeper aspect, this keeper of knowledge, and been a prominent symbol in my life. I think I talked about last time, like my original pentacle, like this like past weekend I sent you guys pictures. I was like, found it. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. And I think that it's having necklace like so from the beginning of my practice, and then realizing as an adult 10 plus years later that this was one of her symbols, like, and having that organically come to me was just really validating, I think, to me.
Yeah.
A
So
reverse
I love
comfort.
that. Definitely, definitely. I also really love the symbol of the serpent as it is often perceived in Hecatean witchcraft. and in just like in a lot of witchcraft spaces in general, as kind of like this divine being that travels from the surface world into the underworld. So I right now we're approaching Samhain as we're recording this, and we really see a lot of talk about these deities. Psychopomps, which Hecate is one of them. Hermes is another one. Anubis is another one. So, just all of them I practice. It's cool. But these are figures that are able to travel from this realm to the underworld or to the land of the dead with ease. They're seen to fairy people. So I symbol of the serpent. And they also, the serpent is also very much equated with knowledge. We see this kind of highlighted in that story of Adam and Garden of Eden, and they remind us that they are transformed. They're symbols of transformation and rebirth. And they remind us that we can shed our skin and be reborn anew, which I think really goes hand in hand with like the personal development aspect of Hecate and witchcraft. So it's just something that I really associate with her, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that serpent imagery as well, B. That's a
Mhm.
symbol I get a lot as well. The snakes, and specifically the snake skins, the sheds.
Yeah.
And just to echo what you said, it's just such a beautiful symbol of transformation and sort of leaving behind that stuff that doesn't serve you, and moving forward
Mhm.
as your better self. I've had people give me snake skins. Like my husband's coworkers have one of his coworkers has a daughter that has a bunch of reptiles,
Mhm.
and I think he had mentioned it like once in passing, and now she always gives me her snake
Oh
skins.
my
She's like,
gosh.
another weirdo. Or like snake bones. Like I've had people give me snake bones before. I also relate her a lot to keys. Obviously, I find skeleton keys everywhere at thrift stores. And I think it might be one of those things where, like, you know how if you meet somebody who drives like a certain car you've never seen before, and then
Mhm.
all of a sudden you can't stop seeing that car everywhere.
Yeah.
I feel like it might be a little
Exactly.
bit of that, but I think it does still hold the same value. It's her way of kind of bringing something to your attention, and then she keeps putting those little reminders sort of in your path to just think of her. And then I think she communicates with me specifically through my dog, because if I'm invoking her in a spell, or if I'm praying to her, or if I'm specifically preparing to have guests over, which is a really big like devotional gesture for me, is to like open up my energy and allow people into my home. I'll notice a lot of times my dog Chevy, she'll go out of her way. She's a very like loner type dog, but she'll go out of her way to come like sort of sit at my heels, or she'll put her head in my lap, which is super out of character for her. She's always been like a really she's like 6 years old now, but she was always like a really scrawny, like anxious, antisocial dog. She was a rescue. We got her from Tijuana, and after I started working with Hecate, she really kind of came into her own, like all of a sudden after 5 years. Like she put on weight and she stopped losing her hair and she became really friendly. um and so she's kind of like healed along with me, so I feel like we sort of have that bond over Hecate where we both belong to her.
That's really incredible. And so, Ryder and B, I just wanted to
Mhm.
ask you real quick. You both talked about the snake imagery and a couple of the things that it represents to you. For me, somehow snakes always got associated with health. So I'm just curious if that factors into your relationship with Hecate at all, or if that is a totally separate relationship of that symbol. Like the Hecate snake imagery, does that align or not align with any of the health aspects for you guys?
So I think it's super interesting you say that, because that and I'm blanking the name of that symbol, but it's the
Yeah,
physician's
the
one with the snake.
catechus, Cadius,
The cat,
or
yes, yeah. And
some.
yes. And that I believe is associated with a child of the god Apollo. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to edit this out if I'm wrong, but um, one of Apollo's epithets, right, is Hekatos, right, which is
Really?
a male version of the name Hecate, which is how I confirmed him in my practice. So it is really interesting that you say that. So I do see the snake imagery that way. But I also see, I think in terms of like that shedding of the skin, that removal of things that you no longer need. I, as somebody who has a snake, knows that you can tell a lot about a snake's health by looking at their shed, by like how intact it is, making sure it's all coming off in one piece, and how like shiny the snake is after. Aspect as well. So I can definitely see that connection with serpents and health for sure.
I feel like your like incredible ability for information recall astounds me every single time. You're like a walking thesaurus. Is incredible.
I just have no other hobbies.
Oh man. Well, okay, so sort of on that, like with the symbols, the next one of the other things that Brandon talks about with receiving communications from Hecate is like in the meditation. And I just thought that was so funny because last time we were doing an episode for the book and I tried doing that meditation, I literally fell asleep every time I tried to do it. um but actually beyond that, meditation is my preferred way to communicate with my team. I just can't get too comfortable, obviously. um but as I mentioned before, I hear things very clearly and explicitly during meditation, and it's always like a straight up conversation. So I find that framework of meditation very helpful because when I'm not in that focus space, I can send thoughts out to my spiritual team, but they're not specific. They're just like a vague idea. And I almost never get a response or help unless I can take the time to fully form sentences and like intentions or requests, etc. And so I think that meditation just really helps me focus with purpose. Similar to that, I also like to use my tarot cards and oracle cards. I'm a big cartomancy practitioner. Um, so I use that in my practice, and I frequently use those to communicate with my deities, which I sort of count under this meditation headspace, because of the flow that I get into to make that work and focus on the symbols. Um, so for me, I sort of feel like as you as a listener, if meditation is interesting to you, but you just can't sit and meditate for 20 minutes or 15 minutes, I feel like it's really any activity that you can get into a flow state of mind that allows your subconscious to come forward. I feel like that counts as meditation under this heading of ways that entities and deities and spiritual connections can happen.
So really, Becky, you're receiving these sort of like direct messages that Brandon talks about next.
Yeah, I would sort of.
Yeah.
They sort of go hand in hand for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, is that like, do you hear them as a whisper? Because she mentions that like some of them audibly could be a whisper or appear as written text in your mind.
So this is really an interesting, sort of like mental health conversation. So when I hear them in my own voice, like I'm having a conversation with myself, but they definitely have different tones. And so when I was first getting into this, I was really concerned that I was going into some sort of like experiencing some form of psychosis, like multiple personality, it's just presenting itself in this way. But they are just there's things that come up that I would have no way of knowing, or perceptions that are presented to me or new ways of thinking about things that I just would not be able to do on my own, that I have to take this for what it's worth. And I will also say that these are not behaviors or voices that I'm hearing that are taking over my life and coming to the forefront of my being. They're just always there as sounding boards, it feels like. So that's a practice that I really engage in, and feel good about. But it did freak me out when I first started it, and being the logical thinker that I am, it's like, what's actually happening here? Because I did question it first.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because, mental health is a big thing, especially within witchcraft. It's talked about a lot within shadow work and other things. But I think we've all had that moment of, am I crazy? And
Yeah. Yeah. Does this actually work? Is this actually what's happening here? Yeah.
Right. But anyway, talking about the direct messages, Ryder, can you talk more on those?
Yeah, it's honestly so funny, Becky, that you said it sounds like your voice in your head, that the way they speak to you, because that's exactly how mine sound. It's just a different tone. It's like my voice, but it's not my voice. I don't know, but you explained it perfectly. It's like a different tone almost. So yes, these direct messages that sort of ping into your mind are what Cindy calls the instant download, and this happens when you're sort of just going about your everyday life and you just suddenly get that message that sort of interrupts your thought, of the deities speaking right into your mind. And it, it makes me think of Voldemort in the last Harry Potter movie, where he's like, Harry Potter, I speak directly to you, but it's just like much less dramatic than that, of course. But yeah, I experience this constantly. And it can take a while to get used to. For me, with Hecate, like I said, it's a more mature, like a deeper tone of voice. It's not my own inner voice, like it's not my own stream of consciousness in my mind. And then it's just like you said, a sounding board. It's like I'm having a conversation with myself, but it's not myself.
Right.
It's sort of like just an unrelated thought in a different voice sort of pops in, and it's like having that conversation. So something that she encourages me to do is to speak up when I have a difference of opinion, which can be super difficult with people in your own inner circle, right? Your family and your friends. If they're being like rude or ignorant about a social justice issue, or if I can just kind of tell they're talking out of their ass, and I used to bite my tongue a lot about this sort of stuff to keep the peace, because I'm a middle child. I'm a peacekeeper. But I'll hear her pipe in sometimes and be like, "So you're gonna let that slide? You're gonna not say anything? You know, like can't let them talk to you like that. Come on." And I know it's her because pre Hecate, I would never have the balls to even think about like correcting an elder, quote unquote, or whatever. But I feel like now I have found the confidence through her to sort of stick up for the greater good in those sort of situations. So if you're questioning, like, is this her? Is this an outside entity, or am I losing my mind and hearing voices? Witchcraft can feel like that. It can feel like you're going crazy sometimes, but you can't find yourself without getting a little lost first. So my advice would be to just sort of embrace the instant download, the instant download, and just take a chance on it. You might find that maybe it's her or a different deity, different spirit altogether. And sometimes the signals can get kind of crossed, right? And we mistake signs for something else. Like you had said, Randy, you had mistaken her for hell at first. I had thought I was connecting with the goddess Caradwyn for a really long time, and it turned out it was the Morrigan. You just kind of got to do the research the best you can, and like read the lore and the verified sources. And it might take a while, but if you're persistent, I do think eventually it will work itself out, and you'll find yourself on the right path with the deity that is calling out to you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say like another like what you're saying, like read the lore, read the original and verified sources, because even with what you were saying, um she she fits that kind of she would be a voice for the marginalized. So it makes sense that it manifested in a way that it was, hey, you need to speak up, especially in the cases where people were being socially unjust, because that's something that is relevant to her. So then she also talks about when she'll speak through events in our lives as opposed to just like direct messages. And I think, another like an example of this was definitely with my dog's death. Um, oh, okay, wow. Hello, hell. Not. But that was a definite misinterpretation, but I think that was like the real defining moment for me. And yeah, finally we have the moments of inner knowing. And B, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. So as you continue your practice working with deities, you really begin to establish like feelings or energy channels that you associate with that deity, or that connection between yourself and that deity, right? And there are times where we just like know things without any evidence. Now, I know that sounds really crazy, and I talk about that a lot when it comes to, intuitive work and trusting your intuition. But sometimes it really comes down to just like knowing something and knowing it without a doubt and trusting that it's coming from that deity that you're working with, right? So, for example, in the forest sometimes my vision does this really like crazy kind of overwhelming thing where it gets really sharp and I become very like hypersensitive or really aware of things, so it's like a very physical and I get this overwhelming feeling of wanting just to like take off and run through the woods. And like at first when I began practicing, this used to like really, really scare the shit out of me, to be honest with you. Especially coming from like a background of Christianity where I hadn't really felt that level of like physical connection with the deity before. Um, I kind of thought it was just like a prey response, honestly, and that someone was about to like mistake me for an animal or something. But over time, I began to experience this same feeling, this wanting to go to the woods and run and become part of the wild hunt, right? When I was working with Hearn. And I started feeling this when I was like working inside, like in my sacred space. And that's kind of like how I put two and two together. So the next time I went to the woods, I felt the feeling, and instead of leaving, I brought him an offering and walked calmly. And since then, I can feel that kind of like it's almost like a fluttering in my chest. That's like the best way to describe it these days. But I've never really been afraid walking through the woods, even like alone at night, like on the way to the bathroom when I can't, like,
That's so incredible, B. It's that I feel like it could be very empowering to sort of have that switch from like that feeling like prey to all of a sudden feeling very like calm and at peace with it.
Yes, definitely.
I think it definitely goes along with a point that Cindy makes. She says, her quote says, use your intuition for interpreting whether something is a sign rather than referring to sources, because this intuition is vital to becoming a powerful witch. And I think what she's saying there is that we have to sort of learn to like work out and flex that intuition muscle as often as we can to eventually be able to just rely on and trust that intuition, because it will become a really powerful tool that you're going to need to lean on and draw from time to time without being able to have the luxury of second guessing yourself.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Cindy then goes on to talk about like if you're seeking Hecate actively. And I really like something that she says, where she refers to them as bathroom moments. There are times when we truly need to establish direct communication with Hecate, when we really need her guidance, intervention, or protection. A dear friend of mine and I call these bathroom moments. This refers to times when we found ourselves on our knees in public bathrooms, crying out for Hecate's assistance. That really got me. I like teared up when I read it the first time because I was like, oh man, like everyone has had multiples of those moments. And I know specifically for me, coming from like a background in Christianity, all of those times, I would fall on my knees and ask for help, and I never received that until the first time I, prayed to Hecate, and I actually received a response, and that was just an overwhelming feeling for me. Um, and then Cindy says, like, when she seems absent, she's present, but I'm not listening. So that was really a big thing for me too, because I have to realize, like, she's not going to abandon me. She's there. I just have to learn to interpret those signs that we've been talking about. And then she also talks about there are different things that you can do to petition Hecate's presence if you feel that you aren't picking up on the signs that are there. For example, like standing in a liminal space, using garlic or roses, or utilizing the dark moon.
But that is not to say that she can't be elusive, which is what she refers to on page 53, and that says, it's not her, it's me. And I really do kind of identify with that, and Cindy's like desire or the importance impressed upon having to establish a meaningful connection with Hecate. I think really the most important thing to keep in mind when establishing this connection with a deity is to do so or goal in mind, and also understand that that purpose or goal may not be aligning with what your best interest might be. So I think the best example of this is something that actually a friend of mine said, and they were like, you can light as many green prosperity candles as you want, you can light them to your heart's content, but if you aren't like putting your resumes out in the mail, how do you expect like a new job just to walk into your life if you're not putting the action in? So while that is, you know, mundane action versus magical intention, I think the same thing can be said with deity work. Like, just because you are lighting all those green candles doesn't mean that this deity is just going everything over to you. And I think that one of those most important things about witchcraft is working with purpose or with intention, but also to be honest with yourself. And I think Hecate is definitely one of those deities that forces you to be honest with yourself.
Truth.
Yeah, for sure. So Cindy kind of wraps up that section by saying, like, you need to be informed. She says to cast your net broadly in terms of looking for resources. So this can be helpful when you're kind of interpreting those signs. But she says that in a lot of cases, it's better to actually rely on your own interpretation before seeking out secondary sources, which I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, but Becky, can you elaborate more on what she meant with that?
Yeah, so I actually really appreciated that because I felt like that was a validation of how I have been approaching my
Interesting.
interactions with energies and deities naturally. So, the first thing that she mentions of like if you have an encounter is to like or something that you think might be a sign or an encounter, the first thing that would help clarify this is to write everything down about it. Be as specific and detailed as possible. You know, you never know what's going to stick out at you later that you might not have been super prominent in the moment. um and not just writing about the external experience but your internal one too. And so like for me, I'd be doing that by just like sharing my stories with you guys, my coven witchy friends, just to describe it and sort of ask for help of figuring it out. But I do that by like saying what it meant to me first, and describe it to you guys first. So that's what I find as the like your own relying on your own interpretation first. And to then to go to the secondary sources. I personally am a big believer that deities or spiritual guides or energies will communicate to you in the language that you know, and a sign for you might be different than the traditional definition in books or on Google because of your specific relationship to that thing. And I think that also ties into your intuition first. Um, or additionally, potentially that the way you do your research will bring you to the right conclusion. I think I heard another TikToker, Piper CJ, explained it at one point of like, uh, working with the deities, like they have Scrabble tiles in front of them, but they're your Scrabble tiles. They can't send you a sign with Scrabble tiles they don't have access to or you don't have access to. And I really subscribe to that belief personally. Um, but in order to help get through this own personal interpretation, Cindy lays out a couple of questions for people who want to write this out and just sort of give you a jumping off point to dig into it and go over later if you're not in the practice currently.
Right. Can you actually talk to us about the first couple prompts?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the first thing she lists is how did they appear to you in detail? For example, was it visual? Was it auditory? Was it a physical object in your world or an animal? Was it a contact in your mind? Did they look or sound a certain way? Was it a person you encountered on the street that just sort of had that energy and that spirit? Any and all of those sorts of details that you can start pulling together threads of information. Secondly, she says, what did they want? So, like, what was said to you? What was shown? Is there a call to action? Or is it just simply an acknowledgement that they are there for you? Like you said, Ryder, that you feel like Hecate puts keys in your life to just sort of like, hey, I'm here. Don't forget. Those are the things that for me, that if they don't make sense right away, that's where you start listing the things to start researching. But before you start researching, again, Cindy reiterates again of going through your own understanding of what you saw. What context do those objects and things have in your own life? And again, also that may not happen. You might not have the clear answer right away. So many of you guys shared your stories about approaching Hecate and interacting with her as delayed reactions or figuring things out later. So just know that this might not be something that you can solve in 5 minutes or even a week potentially.
Well, thank you, Mom. I needed that reminder. I mean, looking back, you're right. I harp on research, but my first reaction to Hecate was to think she was another deity. So obviously I hadn't done my research, but my intuition had kicked in because I think the whole point of that was to say like, oh, I know your dog looked after you, but I'm here now, and that's still the and I have him now, but I'm also looking after you. Um, and that intuitive message didn't change despite the fact that I, came to realize it was Hecate.
Sure.
So Ryder, did you want to talk about the mindset journaling?
Yeah, so this mindset journaling, I think I feel sort of the opposite to what Becky said. I think maybe I'm going to be the chaotic one on this one, but I don't know about this writing everything down, journaling in detail thing. It's not for me. I'm just like not a wordy person. I'm more of like an artsy person, or like a visual person. Um, I have like trouble articulating my thoughts, especially on paper. I think my brain goes too fast for my hand. But I don't think it's necessary to keep a journal and write about every encounter, every experience or download. Um, if journaling is your thing, then go for it. I'm sure it's not going to hurt. It's only going to help you. Um, and definitely as a jumping off point, like Becky said, those are really great prompts for starting out. But I don't agree that it's essential to working with Hecate the way Brennan puts it, because I think she knows. I think Hecate knows if you aren't being genuine, then you're only hurting yourself, and she's not going to waste her time on disingenuous actions. I do, however, agree with the concept of going back to what we were talking about, what she calls the bathroom moments. I mean, it's like a silly turn of phrase out loud, I think, but it definitely gets the point across of those moments in need where you call out to her for help and she comes through. And like you said, we've all experienced those. I've definitely experienced a few myself. And I don't think she would have done that for me if she had believed in my greater intentions and that I was being genuine about like having a two-way street relationship. And then Brennan says a magical life is one of constant conscious self-improvement. And I love that. The having a magical life is really so much about recognizing your own faults and your own weaknesses and then putting in the actual work to turn them into your strengths. And as well as, admitting when you're wrong and humbling yourself enough to want to make it right. There's a lot of magic in just that. And I think that's why I believe Hecate so often comes to people when they are at a low point and they're desperate for that guidance, because she sees that and she recognizes the potential in that desperation. I mean, that's not a great word for it, but she recognizes that there's room for growth and that there's magic in that growth. And then lastly, Brandon talks about the communion or communing, I guess, and being clear about your desired outcome for not just sort of like hanging your wishes on Hecate and hoping something happens without doing anything in return. It's not like she's not a wishing star. So I agree and disagree, because yes, I think it's vital, as with any relationship, you have to give at least as much as you expect to receive. Absolutely. But if you come to her with uncertain expectations and you just sort of kind of figure it out as you go, I think that's also a completely valid path. You don't have to go into working with her with like these like bullet point goals necessarily. I definitely didn't have my life quite figured out when she came to me, and I still don't. But she still accepts me on my journey, even though it's imperfect. And I think that Brandon's perspective on that is reflecting a little of that monotheistic view again. And that's not in any way to invalidate her or throw shade or anything. Everyone has their own familiarity with deity work, their own boundaries. And it's okay if you get into the thick of it first before you find your footing and then make your intentions clear to Hecate. I think just as long as you make sure once you do get your act together that you follow through on your actions, because while I do find that she is patient, she's not necessarily tolerant of negligence.
Not me and my Virgo brain literally having bullet point goals of working with my deities.
I was thinking that. I was like,
Me.
me being the only non-Virgo, I was like, they're all gonna be like, no, we need a detailed outline on Microsoft Word.
Google Docs.
I have like a 5-year plan and it's color coded. So like,
but I do agree that like while that may work for us in our headspace, of course it's not going to work for everybody, and I think that is equally as valid. It's just
well, me, a Virgo with ADHD, I'm like, wait a minute, which list are we talking about? I have several. But yeah, I love what you said, Ryder, when you said I don't have my life quite that figured out and she still accepts me on this journey no matter how imperfect. Because I feel really the same way, and I feel like she's really willing to accept genuine effort, but definitely not in laziness. I know, like personally, I have it written in my notes for this chapter in my notebook that you know, I write the notes for the podcast, like I start them, and that ends up being like part of my notes instead of going into my journal. So I literally have a note in here that's like, it's a lot less detailed than bees, and that's okay. But anyway, with that, the final thing Brandon notes is that it's important to take the steps after the interpretation and going through that process that we then have to apply it to our lives.
Yes, definitely. I feel like the important thing to remember about personal development and witchcraft in general is that it does take a degree of mundane action as well, which is what I think I talked about a little bit earlier. But
I actually had a thought, Randy. You had mentioned it was a while ago that you had made some like fae gardens or fae altars outside, and it wasn't until you had like I'll let you tell it. You didn't have like the information, and then once you did, it was sort of like expected that you would separate their altars.
So I had just just one altar for the fae. And then I had listened to a podcast where it was someone who was really knowledgeable in working with the fae talking about how if you're going to do that, which if you're going to do that, you really need to know what you're doing, that you should really have an altar for both the Seelie and Unseelie quartz because they are very different. And so I had already erected my altar and I was like, well, I'll get around to it. And I started losing everything. Like, I mean, everything. And then they would appear in like the most obvious places. And I really think that was a sign like, hey, uh, you know, you need to do this now that you know. So yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it comes down to following through on those pledges or promises you make to your deities. Like, they're there to help you, but some deities, including Hecate, may not be so patient in waiting for you to fulfill these promises. So I think it's also good to remember this isn't necessarily that love and light, Lord and Lady path that you got to do what you say you're gonna do for sure.
And also a little bit more to your point, B, of like the physical development. Like, say for example, you're just trying to get healthier as a person, but if you go to the grocery store and buy the devil dogs every week,
right?
Like there's only so much that can be done with your petition to your deities.
It's following through and making it more of a lifestyle, I guess, than just fleetingly, which is what I think that Brandon really impresses upon in this framework, is like weaving witchcraft into your life for sure.
Yeah, I think that's like it all comes full circle because it really starts talking about, our course commitments, and like really how have we been doing like with those. So I know for me, mine was basically saying that I wanted to, take the actions in addition to just doing the research because research is my thing. And in my way, what I've done to try to enact that is that I've really taken to more conscious acts of prayer. And along with that, I've made peace with that word. because for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
I definitely had an issue with saying prayer because I just associated that so strongly with Christians and the
Yeah, I'm
Christianity
definitely still
religion.
there, so congratulations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and just from starting this series is when I started to be like, okay, I'm reclaiming that word. So I had to make myself. Um, and I've also like, so like in terms of things that I would actively do, I was pretty much with the Morgan. I would work on like my protections and that kind of thing, and I wouldn't, I wouldn't suffer an insult to me without some kind of retaliation. But Hecate is very different. She just wants me to advance my craft as part of my devotion and veneration of her. And just like Cindy says, we complete her through living a magical life. And I've definitely made more of an effort to make every day a witchy day and not just Wednesdays at 6 o'clock, which is embarrassingly what it used to be for me. Um, so I try to incorporate that in everything I do. So when I cook or when I care for my children or my plants, I do it in a magical way. Would anyone else like to kind of do like a quick check-in on how they're doing with their course commitments?
I just had a thought now that you said that. It's kind of funny. I feel like in the very beginning of my practice, I got into witchcraft because I was like researching like DNA stuff about like why I had gray hair. It was like a whole thing. But
Oh.
once I got into like this research, eventually I like somehow landed on witchcraft, as we do. And that I just like started really getting into like the aesthetic of witchcraft, and I was like, this is like really fun. This like, hunting for tools and like books and stuff like that. Um and the beginning of my practice, the entire first like 6 months to a year of it was very carefree and very unstructured, and it was kind of awesome to just like have this freedom to just like make shit up and be like, this is witchcraft. And then once I started taking my practice a lot more seriously and moved away from the aesthetic of it and more into the actual spiritual practice, I got kind of like weighed down on it, and sometimes I feel like I like have these expectations for myself for my practice where I have to make sure everything is like to the letter and perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me kind of shy away from my practice because I'm like, oh, well, it's like a chore now because I have to like go research all this stuff and like do all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And now that you said it, just made me think like I should just get back to just like being carefree about it and like allow myself to make mistakes and like correct it after, because I think that's probably the best way to learn without getting bogged down by like the specifics of it.
Come to the chaos side.
Yeah.
It was just so much
It's-
more fun. Just like, I'm gonna light this random
It's
candle and use some herbs that I found outside.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that because that has been like what I've been trying to focus on all year this year. Like I've just been like, well, now that my job is like tied to spirituality a little bit, like it technically is a job, like it's a work now. So how do I make this like still be fulfilling for me? And kind of balance that spirituality with work as well. So I feel you on
Yeah.
that for sure.
Becky, did you have any kind of check-in with your I could you remind me what your course commitment was?
Yeah, my course commitments were actually deity commitments, if you remember that I did that completely not according to the guidebook.
That's right.
Persephone's keeping me hydrated and clean, and Horu's keeping me healthy and
Are you hydrated? Like, are you?
so actually though, I have been drinking, okay, so I have one of those 24-ounce water bottles. And I always start my day with a cup of tea, herbal tea. So because it doesn't have caffeine, I have been counting that towards my hydration count. Um, but I would drink one of those and then maybe get through a bottle. And over the last couple of weeks, I'm up to like 3 bottles a day.
Look
Good.
at
So I do
you.
feel
That's
like I have
awesome.
actually moved forward in that.
That's great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're nearing the end of our episode. So I just want to say thanks to all who have tuned in for this next cycle. And as always, we are open to comments, questions, suggestions, anything. We would really like to have an interactive audience. We'll be back with another episode of A Coven Reads Keeping Her Keys next month, covering Lesson 4, which is Hecate and Her Many Names. You can also look forward for the release of another mini episode sometime in the next few weeks. I believe we'll be talking about the importance and the methods for raising power. So we hope you all have a magical rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.